Ladies and gentlemen, this is Bonsert of Radio Retro Future, and today I'm back with another response video where I discuss a video by a acquaintance of mine, actually, Tony Snipes. I haven't spoken to him to a couple of years, I should do that, but he has made this video comparing Steampunk and Dieselpunk. So I'm very curious if Tony will clarify what exactly he means, or if he's gonna talk about it as one single concept. Now, I will not show the end because I want you to go and watch Tony's channel, which I will of course link down below. And with that, we're gonna dig in. At least this is how I intended to start my response video to Tony Snipes. But I was not happy with the result, as I kinda tried to give my own answer to his question, and therefore I needed to write it all out. So what it was intended to be like a quick, easy to produce video that you guys do seem to enjoy, it turned into something of a ramble, and hence I had to write this stuff out. As a matter of fact, I have addressed this same matter a number of years ago when I was still regularly on Facebook, because they were having the same discussions, and I will give a similar answer to my question as I'll do today. So to clarify, Tony Snipes is a very prolific Dieselpunk artist. I highly recommend you check out his stuff. What he makes ranges from illustrations to these awesome STL files of Dieselpunk airplanes and all that kind of stuff. So go check it out. I realize I actually have one of these kits, and I really should get to working on that. For those who are new here, I am Bonsert, and this is a channel, Radio Retro Future, where I created a series called the Steampunk Beginner's Guide to answer the question, what makes steampunk unique for other genres? And viewers have asked me to make something on Dieselpunk. However, I refrained from doing so because, well, for points I will clarify in a moment. But before I give my response to Tony, let's get this out of the way. Don't forget to like, comment and subscribe, and with that said, let's get started with the reaction. As stated before, this was supposed to be an off-the-cuff video, in which I initially started a lot more positive than I'll do in this video, so for that my apologies. Would I sound overly negative? We need to start with why Tony made this particular video, and it is because he observed that there are very little to no Dieselpunk events compared to the number of Steampunk events. That should have been the actual title of the video, as this is not really about the differences but the question on convention attendance. So did he do a good job on explaining why that difference is? And well, I'm not gonna sugarcoat it. I was very disappointed with the video because it does make the same errors that I've been discussing over and over again on my channel, starting that he never mentions what examples are of the Dieselpunk subgenre. To be honest, I don't know what he actually means by subgenre. If you would ask me like what are examples of the Dieselpunk subgenre, I don't really know. All I know is that whenever I bring up certain offers or Dieselpunk in general, I'll have people in the comments blurting out at me that Indiana Jones, Lovecraft or Star Wars are Dieselpunk. And that just brings me to the conclusion that Dieselpunk is whatever you happen to like. I don't know if Tony is in that camp because, well, again, he does not give any examples other than the general sources of inspiration like World War II. And this is that during interviews that I used to do on my channel, I ask my people what their inspiration is. Now, to be clear, this is not a rant against Tony. I'm just responding to the arguments that are demonstrated in this video, many from which are coming from his own community. My problem with many of these arguments is that I already heard these same ones being repeated 10 years ago, just to indicate how far this conversation has evolved since then, which is not at all, and I said the same about Steampunk, by the way. So I'm here to share my own insights and why I think Dieselpunk doesn't have the reach that it does. But first, what does Tony mean with Dieselpunk, and what does Grove mean? Well, he doesn't really clearly define it. Although he briefly touches upon it being a retro-futuristic aesthetic, he mostly talks about a lack of conventions and social events. This topic kinda annoys me because there's this implication that the popularity of a genre can only be determined based on convention attendance, and I don't agree with that at all. And I mentioned on this channel before that I believe that the costume community of the steampunk excludes like this wide scala of other creatives that do not get any attention from them. But to get back on track, what is steampunk and how is it different from dieselpunk? And here's the thing, that steampunk can refer to one of three things. It can refer to an aesthetic, it can refer to a genre of stories, or it can refer to the costume community, two of which we have already discussed. However, in this video he also brings up general appeal. Now, he's not very clear on what dieselpunk means in this context. Dieselpunk, I believe, is a very well-known concept, in particular in gaming, but in online discussions on Facebook and places like that, gaming often gets overlooked because the people, meaning both steampunks and dieselpunks, when discussing this topic only care about the conventions and what they see on TV. So, yes, there is a generational gap in this conversation, but it's also, you know, what kind of media are you exposed to? And when it comes to TV and film, dieselpunk indeed get very little exposure. But if I would have to say when I would include gaming into the discussion, I'd still say that steampunk is more popular. But in an aesthetic sense. If it's about narrative, I think they're about on par. But I cannot make any statements on that because, again, Tony has not given me any examples of what he thinks is dieselpunk. If you ask me why, I'd say it's because the aesthetic is more versatile. For example, the steampunk aesthetic can be very easily be implemented in both fantasy and sci-fi, whereas the dieselpunk aesthetic, well, that brings me to one of my personal insights. The dieselpunk aesthetic is hopelessly American. Let me explain. One thing that I missed in the videos was dieselpunk's relationship to pop culture. I believe this is the key to understanding the whatever punks. Whenever something reaches the general consciousness, you can bet there will be a steampunk version of it on the internet. Be it Disney or Marvel, there is steampunk of it. And this is also part of steampunk's appeal. Even if you don't care about the history that inspired the fashion, you can still be attracted by the pop culture references and vice versa. And this is where dieselpunk becomes exclusive. Because the aesthetics are that focused on Americana and the American perspective of history, it just includes the larger audience. And this is just an observation, not an accusation. Steampunk 2 is a niche, and that makes dieselpunk a niche of a niche. And there's another thing. Tony called steampunk and dieselpunk cousins. I don't disagree with that observation, but creatively, as a writer of fiction and art director, I do consider dieselpunk an aesthetic subset of steampunk. I do use dieselpunk-esque aesthetics and tropes in the Association of Ishtar. It just depends on what story I am telling, but I'll elaborate on that in a separate video. Going back to pop culture, here's a bit of a tangent, but I think it will shine a light on some things. The American recollection of the war era is very different from that of the old world. While Yanks were holding victory parades and arguing about the ethics about nuking Japan, my father was trying not to starve while my mother's family was stuck in a Japanese prison camp. Not saying that the Americans make no sacrifices, I'm just saying that in the minds of the American civilian, the war experience was a bit different from the average European living under occupation. The average American will tell tales of his father storming the beaches of Normandy, while mine worried about whatever had become of his Jewish classmates that stopped coming to school. Although in the former occupied countries there had been a lot of copium proclaiming that every man, woman and child was secretly a resistance fighter, in fact the hunt for collaborators went on well into the 60s and beyond. If you look for Dutch literature about that era, it's either about to defeat the oppression or the few that managed to jump ship to England and continue the fight overseas. Ergo, the heroic idea of mecha piloting pin-up models fighting the Huns never really caught on. Dieselpunk is purely an American import here as far as I can tell, not meaning European creators have not dabbled in it, but as far as I can tell, it stayed in the confines of the American fuck yeah military tropes. On that topic, one of my favorite Dieselpunk designers is Ranj Murata, who uses interbellum fashion combined with Art Deco, who is also responsible for the creation of one of my favorite anime, Last Exile, a sci-fi show that inspired me to go into retrofuturism to begin with. For a more recent example is that a couple of years ago we had this costume concept called Ragtag, where we used Swiss uniforms from the 1930s as a base for our steampunk soldier idea. A concept many fans of Dieselpunk will enjoy, I'm sure. We had this friend at the time who hung around with us from time to time. When I asked her if she ever wanted to join us, she told me that she was from the former Soviet Union, which meant that she grew up around people wearing uniforms and wasn't eager to become one of those. But despite this tirade, I don't think this is the reason why there are no Dieselpunk conventions. So let's go to the next argument that I really would like to respond to. Steampunk is whimsical while Dieselpunk is gritty, and that is why it's more popular. First, Tony uses Mary Poppins and Chitty Chitty Bang Bang as examples of steampunk. They're not steampunk! Not even close. Also, neither takes place in the Victorian era, so I don't even know how he got to this conclusion. Even if these films were steampunk, it's still just cherry picking. That said, I could pick Lekka Daisy, a animated musical I'm sure many Dieselpunks will enjoy, and say therefore the genre is whimsical. How about Singing in the Rain or Modern Times? Well, if you can use Mary Poppins, I surely as well can use these two. However, I could also take Frostpunk and They Are Billions and conclude that all of steampunk is post-apocalyptic and about cannibalism. So, is there any truth to the claim that steampunk is whimsical? So here are some of the latest steampunk franchises that became very popular. How many of these would you label as whimsical? Of course, there's also this assumption in there that whimsical sells. Well, let's have a look at the biggest movie franchises in 2023. And apart from Harry Potter, I wouldn't call any of these particularly whimsical. And this is just a list of movies that doesn't include other types of franchises like Warhammer 40k or Game of Thrones. Of course, Tony was talking about the conventions, not the media, so what should we really be asking is, what drives people to steampunk conventions? Well, in the 90s, a lot of people saw Wild Wild West, a Weird West film with Will Smith, and it has this mechanical spider robot that everybody loved, and that's about it. Like, really, do not watch this film. Regardless, it's inspired many people to look into the community that merged at the start of what is now the age of self-publishing, called the Iron Age of Media. In 2012, the steampunk scene exploded at the conventions and it became pretty prevalent until the coup happened. Now I'd say that by 2020-2021 the scene was already on a downswing, but I'd say that the intending audiences still need to recover from the quarantine and get their creative engines started. But social events are still happening. So why is that? How did steampunk manage to continue while so many creatives turned their back on events? And in this particular case, why did Dieselpunk not? Here's the thing, I don't think the problem is aesthetics, mood or stories. What most important is that the steampunk community is quite unique. The reason why I mention the Iron Age is that I think it's related to the change in relationship between consumers have with entertainment. Before the internet, we had actual pop culture. Everyone listened to the same radio stations, watched the same shows, the same songs. But with the dawn of the internet, this was a thing of the past. Everyone could make their own media with only a computer and an internet connection. Every garage band with a webcam could become an overnight sensation. And with social media, you didn't need a budget anymore to promote your events. And steampunks use this very efficiently. But what might have started as an event to bring creatives with similar interests together became a social scene in a similar way that Goth did. But this social experience became arguably more important than the actual creators, and this is why many creators became disillusioned with the scene. Steampunk are social animals, and these events are organized by steampunks for steampunks. And when you browse their Facebook pages, all the posts are about the events and pictures they have taken. You could argue that they use whimsy to augment the experience, but it's there to augment the social experience. I'm talking about events like teapot racing and tea dueling. But what does this say about Dieselpunks? Well, I think it's very simple. They're not the social animals steampunks are. If they were, why don't they organize more events? I mean, that's how steampunks did it. Now, of course, you can argue that there are not as many people familiar with the term dieselpunk, but please humor me for a moment. Of course, this is all speculation, but this is what I see when I would compare dieselpunk groups with steampunk groups on Facebook. They are two different cultures. Steampunk often treat the groups as social places and tend to ban creators for promoting their work, as they are seen as intrusive. Dieselpunk groups behave far more as fans/consumers do, sharing vintage comics, and are far more respectful to creatives. Now, I wouldn't be surprised that many of my backers on Kickstarter are in fact members of these Dieselpunk groups. Please let me know if you are. So yeah, I realize that's a lot of build up to a very banal explanation, but that's how I feel about this topic. And quite frankly, I don't think you should mind. I mean, if you really do want to get together, I mean, we have the internet. You can contact people all over the world. I think the real question should be, what is stopping you from coming together? And start there. So let me end on this question. This is the thumbnail that Tony had used on the video. Now, I already gave my response to the inclusion of Mary Poppins, but there we have Angelina Jolie from Sky Captain and the World of Tomorrow, from which I can conclude that this is what Tony means with Dieselpunk. Here's the real problem that I have, is that people do not separate the aesthetic from the source of inspiration. Let's take Mary Poppins. I'm sure there are a lot of steampunks who really enjoyed Mary Poppins, and yes, maybe it has inspired a steampunk story or two, but that doesn't mean that Mary Poppins has to be steampunk or anything else that has inspired the steampunk genre. As I said, I was very inspired by Last Exile, but that's a sci-fi show, not a steampunk one. So when it comes to what people associate with the dieselpunk aesthetic, I can clearly see the influences from noir, pulp, and all those other genres. But my real question is, what makes dieselpunk stories and dieselpunk aesthetics different from that of the old pulp serials? And that's my final question for you. I hope to read your replies in the comments, because I really would like to know, and then I can include it in future videos. And with that, ladies and gentlemen, I am going to bid you adieu. Don't forget that we recently published a new lore video in regards to our own steampunk mecha, the CB trees and their origins. That's going to be the next lore video. Is going to be about the International Penal Legion, so we can finally get into the history and lore about the creation of our steampunk mecha, the CB trees. And of course, if you enjoy this type of content, please don't forget to like, comment and subscribe. And don't forget, we publish our stories weekly on REAM Stories, where you can become a follower for free, or become a paying member like all these wonderful patrons, and get access to ebooks and previews to upcoming publications, including STL files and wallpapers. And with that, ladies and gentlemen, I'm gonna bid you adieu, and as always, make things your way.